The slap of the revolving door barely registered over the noise of the lobby before the woman behind the front desk looked up and immediately looked away again. That small, almost imperceptible act, that flicker of dismissal, would cost her everything before the night was over. Marcus Webb walked through the entrance of the Caldwell Grand carrying a 7-year-old girl on his back and a duffel bag over his shoulder that had seen better days. His jeans had a small tear near the left knee. His jacket was a faded olive green, the kind you could find at any thrift store. His sneakers were clean but scuffed at the toe, and there was a faint shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes that no amount of sleep could fully erase. He looked like a man who had been fighting very hard for a very long time and was only still standing because he had someone small depending on him not to fall. The little girl on his back was Zoe. She had her father's dark eyes and her late mother's wide, curious smile, and she was wearing a purple coat with a hood shaped like a bear's head, ears and all, that she absolutely refused to take off, even indoors, even in summer. She had her chin propped on her father's shoulder and was staring around the grand lobby of the Caldwell Grand with the open, wondering expression that only children and first-time visitors to extraordinary places can manage. "Daddy," she whispered, and the whisper carried that particular reverence children reserve for churches and aquariums and places that feel too big for ordinary words. "It's so shiny." Marcus smiled despite everything. "Yeah, baby. It is." The Caldwell Grand was shiny.
It was more than shiny.
It was the kind of hotel that stopped people mid-conversation when they stepped through the door. The ceilings vaulted 30 feet above a marble floor polished to the consistency of still water. A chandelier the size of a small car hung at its center, constructed from thousands of hand-blown glass drops that caught the light and scattered it across every surface in shifting fragments of gold. The reception desk was a sweep of dark mahogany and brushed brass. Fresh, white lilies stood in tall vases at strategic intervals. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something floral and impossibly expensive. And standing behind the reception desk, watching Marcus walk through her lobby, was Diane. Diane Hargrove had worked the front desk of the Caldwell Grand for 6 years. She was precise, efficient, and possessed of a particular talent for reading people, or at least, she believed she was. She wore her hair in a tight knot and her uniform with military exactness. She had a smile she deployed like a weapon, warm and targeted, calibrated perfectly for the guests who deserved it and withheld with equal precision from those who, in her private and carefully curated opinion, did not belong. She watched Marcus cross the lobby and she cataloged him the way she cataloged everyone: the torn jeans, the old jacket, the beat-up duffel bag, the child on his back dressed like a stuffed animal. She processed all of it in under 2 seconds and drew her conclusion the way a switchblade opens, fast and sharp and already out before the thought was fully conscious. This man was not a guest. She didn't know what he was, someone's driver, maybe, or a delivery person who had wandered in through the wrong door. She didn't particularly care. She just knew, with the calm certainty of someone who had sorted people into categories for 6 years without ever being corrected, that he was not her problem. She looked back down at her screen. Marcus reached the desk. He set the duffel bag down at his feet, steadied Zoe on his back with one hand, and waited. Diane did not look up. He waited another moment. "Excuse me." Diane clicked something on her keyboard. "I'll be right with you," she said, in the tone that meant she wouldn't be. Zoe's little hand appeared over Marcus's shoulder and tapped him twice. "Daddy." She didn't look at us. "I know," Marcus said quietly. "Is that rude?" "Zoe." "It seems rude." Marcus suppressed a smile and waited. 2 full minutes passed. Behind him, the lobby continued its elegant business. A bellhop crossed with a luggage cart. A couple in expensive coats consulted with a concierge. A business traveler in a suit walked past without breaking stride. The chandelier threw its fractured light across the floor in slow, shifting patterns. Finally, Diane looked up. She managed a version of her professional smile, thinner than the one she gave to the couple in expensive coats, barely warm enough to qualify. "Can I help you?" The phrasing was right. The tone was all wrong. It carried within it a note that said, "I doubt it." "Yes," Marcus said. He shifted Zoe on his back and placed both hands on the counter. I have a reservation.
Webb.
Marcus Webb. Diane typed. Her expression did not change in any way that a camera could have captured, but something in the set of her mouth shifted, a barely there tightening, as though the name had produced a small discrepancy she was not prepared for. She typed again. She frowned at the screen with the micro-expression of someone whose neatly organized mental category is producing an inconvenient result.
Webb, she repeated.
Marcus Webb. She typed a third time. I'm not finding anything under that name. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Can you try again? Marcuswebb. Sir, I know how to spell. The professionalism was thinning now, the smile giving way to something more like impatience. I've searched the system twice. There's no reservation under that name. Marcus was quiet for a moment. What about under Caldwell Properties? Diane looked at him. The name landed on her face in a way she wasn't quick enough to conceal, a small widening of the eyes, a fraction of a second where her professional composure developed a visible crack. But she recovered quickly, with the ease of long practice, and the look she replaced it with was even cooler than before, as though she was punishing him for making her stumble. Caldwell Properties, she said. Yes. She typed. The crack in her composure returned, slightly wider this time, and she looked up at him with eyes that were reevaluating something but hadn't yet reached a conclusion she was comfortable with. There's a reservation, she said carefully, under Caldwell Properties. But that's... She paused. That's a corporate account. I know. Those are typically reserved for. I'm aware of what they're reserved for. Her eyes moved over him again. The jacket, the bag, the child in the barriered hood, and she made her decision. She closed the corporate account screen and opened a different tab. Sir, I think perhaps there's been some confusion. Corporate reservations through Caldwell Properties are for business partners and executives of the company. They're not. I know what they are, Marcus said. His voice was still even. He had the voice of a man who had learned to keep things even, who had practiced it and sharpened it until it was automatic. Only someone paying very close attention would have noticed that his jaw had tightened slightly, or that his hands, flat on the counter, had stopped being relaxed. Zoe, who was paying very close attention, noticed. Daddy, she said close to his ear. It's okay, Zoe. Diane squared her shoulders. Sir, perhaps if you could provide some documentation. Like what? Some form of credential linking you to the corporate account. A company ID, perhaps. Or a contact at Caldwell, who could verify. I'd like to speak to your manager, Marcus said. The shift was immediate and visible. Diane's posture stiffened by a degree that could only be described as defensive. In her experience, this request from someone who looked like Marcus Webb was a routine escalation, the kind that ended with a supervisor repeating what she had said, only in a slightly more apologetic register, before the situation resolved itself the way it always did. I can certainly get my supervisor, she said, in the tone of someone granting a meaningless concession. Please. She picked up the phone and made a brief call, her voice low, her eyes not leaving Marcus. When she set it down, she folded her hands on the counter with a precise kind of patience that was designed to be mildly humiliating, the patience of someone who has already determined the outcome and is merely waiting for the other person to accept it. Zoe slid off her father's back and stood beside him, slipping her hand into his. She looked up at Diane with the frank, unguarded gaze of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned to mask what she sees. You don't look very happy, Zoe informed her.
Zoe, Marcus said. She doesn't, though.
Diane did not respond to this. Her eyes moved briefly to the child and then back to a neutral point above Marcus's shoulder. The supervisor arrived quickly. His name was Glenn Marsh, and he was the kind of man who had risen to middle management by being endlessly agreeable in both directions, agreeable to the guests who spent money and agreeable to the superiors who determined his career trajectory. He was in his late 40s, with the complexion of someone who had spent a great many years under fluorescent light, and he materialized at Diane's side with the practiced ease of a man who had been summoned to defuse this particular type of situation before. He looked at Marcus.
He looked at Zoe.
He looked at the duffel bag. He drew the same conclusion Diane had drawn. in approximately the same time it had taken her, and the smile he turned on Marcus was the careful, diplomatic smile of someone delivering a polite refusal. "Good evening, sir. I'm Glenn Marsh, the front desk manager. How can I assist you?" "Marcus Webb. I have a reservation, or rather, the reservation is under Caldwell Properties." Glenn's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see. And your connection to Caldwell Properties would be?" "I own it," Marcus said. There was a silence. It was not a long silence. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, a great many things happened. Diane's hands, still folded on the counter, went very still. Glenn's carefully maintained smile stopped moving, like a clock whose mechanism has suddenly seized. The pleasant ambient sound of the lobby, footsteps on marble, the distant chime of an elevator, the low murmur of conversations, continued exactly as before, indifferent to the small catastrophe unfolding at the front desk. "I'm sorry," Glenn said. "Caldwell Properties," Marcus said, and his voice was still even, still measured, still carrying that quality of a man who has learned to keep things even. "I'm the owner."
CEO.
"Founder. Whatever title makes this clearest, this is my hotel." Glenn's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Sir, I'll need to verify that," Marcus said.
Please.
"Verify it." Glenn turned to the computer. His fingers moved over the keyboard with slightly less precision than usual. He opened screens Marcus could not see from his side of the counter, and the longer he looked, the more color left his face, evacuating in steady degrees the way water drains from a tub, and in approximately the same direction. "Oh," said Glenn Marsh. It was barely a word, more a sound that a man makes when the floor shifts beneath him, and he has not yet decided whether to try to remain standing. "You'll find," Marcus said, "that the reservation was made last week, by my assistant, under the Caldwell Properties executive account that I use when I travel to our properties without advance notice. I do it that way on purpose." Glenn was nodding now, though it was unclear whether he was nodding at Marcus or at the screen or at some internal conversation he was having with himself about the past several minutes and what they were going to mean for his career. "Mr. Webb," he started. "You can call the corporate office if you need to. Ask for Patricia Osei. She's my chief of staff. She made the booking. She'll confirm everything." "That won't be." "I believe you, sir. That's not." Glenn straightened and ran a hand briefly across his forehead. He turned to Diane, and the look that passed between them was the wordless communication of two people who have just realized they are both standing in the same hole. Diane had gone very still. The color in her face was different now, too, not drained like Glenn's, but height, a flush spreading up her neck. "Mr. Webb," Glenn said, turning back with the desperateness of a man trying to catch something that is already falling, "I sincerely apologize for the confusion." "Is there a room for me?" Marcus asked. "Of course. Immediately. Absolutely." Glenn was moving now, typing, pulling up the reservation with the efficiency of a man whose job may depend on the speed of his recovery. "We have the Caldwell suite available. It's our premiere. Whatever's in the reservation is fine." "Mr. Webb." "Whatever's in the reservation," Marcus repeated. He looked at Diane, who was not looking at him. "I'd also like to speak with whoever is responsible for HR in this building. Tonight, if possible." A pause. "I think it's clear that what happened tonight was not an isolated incident." He said it flatly, not as a question. Catherine Voss was a woman who had succeeded in her career by knowing when not to hedge. "No," she said. "I don't believe it was." He turned from the window. Zoe had found a decorative pillow on the king-sized bed, small and square and embroidered with the hotel's crest, and was examining it with the serious interest she applied to anything she had not encountered before. "I opened my first hotel when I was 24, Marcus said. "I was working 3 other jobs at the time. I drove a used car with a transmission that made a sound like a dying animal every time I changed gears. I wore the same 3 shirts on rotation. I had an investor who dropped out 6 weeks before opening, and I had to cover the gap myself, which meant I ate rice and eggs for 2 months straight."
He paused.
"I know exactly what it looks like to have nothing. I know what it looks like from the inside." Catherine was listening without moving. What I built, he continued, is supposed to be a place where that doesn't matter. Where you can walk in the door and be treated with dignity, regardless of what you're wearing or what you're carrying, or whether your car makes a bad sound. He looked at her steadily. That is not what happened tonight. No, Catherine said. It wasn't. I want to know what the policy is, he said. And then I want to know if the policy is what's being practiced, or if what happened tonight is what's actually happening. I understand. I'm going to want to meet with your training team. And I'm going to want to see the guest feedback from the past year, specifically any complaints that have a pattern. Of course. But tonight, he said, and there was a quieter note in his voice now, something that was less owner and more just a man who was very tired. Tonight, I need to put my daughter to bed. Catherine Voss nodded. She left the room with the swift, silent efficiency of someone who had understood clearly what was being asked of her and what wasn't. Marcus turned to Zoe, who had moved from the pillow to the bathroom, where she had discovered with enormous satisfaction that there were robes. Small robes, one of which was apparently in exactly her size. Daddy, she called, there's a robe that fits me. I see that. It says Caldwell on it. She appeared in the bathroom doorway, wearing the robe over her barriered coat, which she still had not removed. Does that mean us? Marcus looked at his daughter for a moment, at her wide, wondering eyes, at the way she was standing with both hands stuffed in the robe's pockets, at the coat with the barriers sticking up over the collar, at the expression on her face that was made entirely of openness and curiosity and the fearless assumption that the world was a place where things worked out. Her mother had looked like that, right up until she didn't. He crossed the room and crouched down to her level. Yeah, Zoe, he said. That means us. She considered this, with appropriate gravity. Then she pulled one of her small hands out of the robe pocket and placed it on his face in the particular way she had, palm to cheek. That was both a gesture of comfort and an act of possession, her hand saying what she didn't have the words for yet, which was, "You are mine and I am yours, and that is the entire world." I like it here, she said.
Good.
Can we come back? He smiled. It was the kind of smile that takes a long time to arrive. We can come back any time you want. She removed her hand from his face and turned back to the bathroom with the brisk efficiency of a 7-year-old who has made a decision. I'm going to wear the robe in the bath. And the coat. You're not wearing the coat in the bath. I might. Zoe. She disappeared into the bathroom. The sound of running water followed. Marcus stayed crouched on the floor for another moment. Then he stood and walked to the window and looked out at the city, at all its fragmented lights, at the grid of streets below, at the distance he had traveled to get here, measured not in miles but in everything else, in all the units that don't fit on a map. He had not built the Caldwell Grand because he wanted luxury. He had built it, along with the 11 other properties under the Caldwell umbrella, in 6 cities, ranging from a small boutique in Vermont to a full-service resort in Arizona, because at 24, driving that car with a transmission that sounded like a dying animal, he had walked into a hotel lobby in his best shirt and been looked at the way Diane Hargrove had looked at him tonight. He had been assessed and found insufficient in approximately 3 seconds by someone standing behind a front desk, and he had felt the particular cold weight of that dismissal in a way that was about much more than the hotel room. He had wanted to build something different. He had largely succeeded. And then, apparently, at his own flagship property, in his own city, a woman who had worked at his front desk for 6 years had looked at him through his own lobby and given him the exact feeling he had spent his entire adult life building a corrective to. He heard Zoe singing something tunelessly from the bath. He pressed his fingers against the cold glass of the window. Downstairs, in the manager's office, Catherine Voss was on the phone with the hotel's director of human resources. Diane Hargrove was in the back office, in a chair beside her locker, with a look on her face that was slowly moving from defensive to something more complicated, more difficult, in the way that expressions move when a person is very quietly and very privately beginning to reckon with something they have not let themselves look at before. Glenn Marsh was in the break room. He had made himself a cup of coffee and had not drunk any of it. The investigation that Catherine Voss initiated that night turned up what Marcus had suspected, that the pattern was real. 3 guest complaints in the past 14 months, all describing variations of the same experience. A woman who had mentioned feeling unwelcome at check-in. a man who had used the word humiliated, a couple who had written simply that the front desk staff had made them feel like they didn't belong. None of the complaints had named Diane specifically. All of them had occurred during her shifts. Diane was terminated the following morning, after a meeting with HR, Catherine Voss, and a representative from the corporate office who had been on the phone with Marcus at 7 a.m. Glen Marsh was placed on a performance improvement plan, given mandatory retraining in guest relations, and told with considerable clarity that his ability to remain in his role depended on a demonstrated shift in how he managed his team's behavior toward guests. The termination was not done with cruelty. Marcus had been specific about that on the phone. He had not wanted ceremony or humiliation. He had wanted accountability, and he had wanted it handled with a kind of dignity that Diane had failed to extend to him, not because he was inclined to be generous toward her, but because the manner of the thing mattered, and it had always mattered, and he was not going to betray the principle to make a point about the principle. Diane received her severance. She received a clear accounting of why the decision had been made. She was given the opportunity to say what she wanted to say, and she had said very little, which was itself a kind of answer. What she did say near the end of the meeting surprised Catherine Voss. She said, "I didn't realize I was doing it." And then, after a moment, or maybe I did realize. I don't know. I don't know which one is worse. Catherine Voss reported this to Marcus in a brief update call that afternoon. She relayed it precisely, without editorializing, in the manner of someone who trusted the other person to draw their own conclusions. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Set up the training review. All guest-facing staff. I want it comprehensive. And I want it to be about why this matters, not a checkbox. I want people to understand why it matters." "I'll handle it personally," Catherine said. "Good." He paused. "And Catherine, you're good at your job. Tonight being what it was, I want you to know that. This isn't on you." She thanked him and hung up and sat for a moment at her desk, which faced a window that looked out over the same street that Marcus's window overlooked, 14 floors higher. That evening, Marcus took Zoe to the hotel's restaurant. He had not called ahead. He had not mentioned to anyone that he was coming. He just walked in with his daughter in her barriered coat, which she had now added the Caldwell robe to as a second layer, creating an ensemble that she was clearly very pleased with. The host who greeted them was a young man of about 22 named Theo, who had been working at the Caldwell Grand for 8 months and who had not been present the night before and knew nothing of what had happened. He looked at Marcus and Zoe with an expression of complete and natural warmth, the real kind, the kind that doesn't require calculation, and said, "Good evening. Table for 2. "Table for 2, Marcus confirmed. "Wonderful. Right this way." He scooped up 2 menus and led them to a window table with a view that was slightly different from the suite, but no less extraordinary. He handed the menus over and crouched down briefly to address Zoe at her own level. "I love your coat," he said. Zoe looked at him with great seriousness. "It has ears." "I can see that. Very practical." "For warmth," she confirmed. "Absolutely essential." He straightened and smiled at Marcus. "Can I start you off with some water?" "Please," Marcus said. After Theo left, Zoe opened her menu and held it in front of her face and studied it with the focused intensity she applied to everything. Most of it she couldn't read yet, but she was working on it, mouthing the words to herself with small movements of her lips. "Daddy," she said, from behind the menu.
"Yeah."
"That man was nice." "Yeah," Marcus said. "He was. Not like the lady from last night." Marcus looked at her. She was still studying the menu, turning it slightly to catch the light. There were a great many things he wanted to say about people and how they could change or not change, about how much of what other people did was about them and not about you, about how the work of building something, a hotel, a life, a sense of yourself that the world's dismissals couldn't fully touch, was ongoing and slow and sometimes required that you walk back into the lobby where someone had just looked right through you and ordered dinner anyway, because the dinner was good, and the company was better, and you had earned your seat at the table, in every sense of the phrase. He didn't say any of this. She was 7. There would be time. "What do you want to eat?" he asked. She lowered the menu. Her dark eyes were bright. "They have pasta," she announced. "They do." With the good cheese. Parmesan. That one. She set the menu down with a finality that indicated the decision had been made. Then she looked around the restaurant, at the other diners, at the warm amber light, at the quiet orchestration of the floor staff moving between tables, and then back at her father, and she asked with the direct, uncomplicated curiosity of someone who had not yet learned that some questions were complicated. Do we own all of this? Marcus looked around too. At all of it. At the restaurant he had designed with a friend from architecture school. At the light fixtures he had spent 3 weeks choosing. At the menu that had been built around his conviction that good food should make people feel cared for. At the room that was part of the thing he had built when he had nothing, when he was driving a car that sounded like a dying animal and eating rice and eggs for 2 months straight and believing, in the unreasonable and necessary way that people believe in things when they have no evidence yet, that this was possible.
Yeah, he said.
We do. Zoe nodded, absorbing this with the same gravity she had applied to the robe and the chandelier and the cheese. Then she reached across the table and took a piece of bread from the basket and began eating it with great contentment, as though the matter was settled and had always been obvious, and the world was exactly what it should be, and there was nothing left to do but enjoy dinner. Above them, the chandelier turned and scattered its light. The restaurant hummed with the sound of other people's evenings, glasses and laughter and the low, warm undertow of conversation, and at a window table near the east wall, a man in a faded olive jacket sat across from a small girl in a barriered coat, and they were exactly where they were supposed to be. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It means more than you know. Drop a comment below telling us about a time someone underestimated you and what happened next. And if you're new here, subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. We'll see you in the next one.